So I left you on a cliffhanger, which is always fun. A cliffhanger is when you're at a pretty suspenseful part, a turning point of sorts, or just a suspenseful part and you stop. So I'm going to reread the last sentence. There you go, someone shouted as the back door of the storeroom slammed shut. Stacy turned quickly and sped to the back of the building. TJ was fleeing straight toward Soldiers Road. Stacy tore across the Wallace yard and, leaping high like a forest fox, fell upon TJ, knocking him down. The two boys rolled toward the road, each trying to keep the other's back pinned to the ground, but then Stacy, who was stronger, gained the advantage, and TJ, finding that he could not budge him, cried, "Hey, wait a minute, man, let me explain." Stacy did not let him finish. Jumping up, he pulled TJ up too and hit him squarely in the face. TJ staggered back, holding his eyes as if he were badly hurt, and Stacy momentarily let down his guard. At that moment, TJ rammed into Stacy, forcing the fight to the ground again. Little man Christopher John and I, with the others, circled the fighters, chanting loudly as they rolled back and forth, punching at each other. All of us were so engrossed in the battle that no one saw a mule wagon halt on the road and a giant man step out. It wasn't until I realized that the shouting had stopped behind us and that the girls and boys beside me were falling back that I looked up. Mr. Morrison towered over us. He didn't look at me or Christopher John, a little man, although I knew he had seen us, but walked straight to the fighters and lifted a still swinging Stacy off TJ. After a long, tense moment, he said to Stacy, "You and your sister and brothers get on in the wagon." We walked through the now silent crowd. Caleb and Dewberry Wallace, standing on the front porch of the store with the Simses, stared at Mr. Morrison as we passed, but Mr. Morrison looked through them as if they weren't there. Stacy sat in front of the wagon with Mr. Morrison. The rest of us climbed into the back. "Now we gonna get it," shuddered Christopher John. "I told y'all we should have gone on home." Before Mr. Morrison took the reins, he handed Stacy a handkerchief in which to wrap his bruised right hand, but he did not say a word, and it wasn't until we had passed the crossroads leading to Great Faith that the silence was broken. "Mr. Morrison, you gonna tell Mama?" Stacy asked, huskily. Mr. Morrison was very quiet as Jack the mule clopped noisily along the dry road. "Seems I heard your mama tell you not to go to that Wallace store," he said at last. "Yes, sir," said Stacy, glancing nervously at Mr. Morrison. Then he blurted out, "But I had a good reason. Ain't never a reason good enough to disobey your mama." The boys and I looked woefully at each other. My bottom stung from the awful thought of Mama's leather strap against it. "But Mr. Morrison," I cried anxiously, "TJ was hiding there because he thought Stacy wouldn't come down there to get him. But Stacy had to go down there because TJ was cheating." "And hush, Cassie," Stacy ordered, turning sharply around. I faltered for only a moment before deciding that my bottom was more important than Stacy's code of honor. And Stacy had to take the blame for it. Mama whipped him right in front of God and everybody. Once the truth had been disclosed, I waited with dry throat and nauseous stomach for Mr. Morrison to say something. When he did, all of us strained tensely forward. "I ain't gonna tell her," he said quietly. Christopher John sighed with relief. "Ain't going down there no more neither," he promised. Little man and I agreed, but Stacy stared long and hard at Mr. Morrison. "How come, Mr. Morrison?" he asked. "How come you ain't gonna tell Mama?" Mr. Morrison slowed Jack as we turned into the road leading home. "'Cause I'm leaving it up to you to tell her." "What?" we exclaimed together. "Sometimes a person's gotta fight," he said slowly. "But that store ain't the place to be doing it. From what I hear, folks like them Wallaces got no respect at all for colored folks, and they just think it's funny when we fight each other. Your mama know them Wallaces ain't good folks. That's why she don't want y'all down there, and y'all owe it to her and yourselves to tell her. But I'm gonna leave it up to y'all to decide." Stacy nodded thoughtfully and wound his handkerchief tighter around his wounded hand. His face was not scarred, so if he could just figure out a way to explain the bruises on his hand to Mama without lying, he was in the clear. For Mr. Morrison hadn't said he had to tell her, but for some reason I could not understand, he said, "All right, Mr. Morrison, I'll tell her." "Boy, you crazy!" I cried as Christopher John and Little Man speedily came to the same conclusion. If he didn't care about his own skin, he could at least consider ours. But he seemed not to hear us as his eyes met Mr. Morrison's, and the two of them smiled in subtle understanding, the distance between them fading. As we neared the house, Mr. Granger's Packard rolled from the dusty driveway. Mr. Morrison directed Jack to the side of the road until the big car had passed, then swung the wagon back into the road center and up the drive. Big Ma was standing by the yard gate that led on to the drive, gazing across the road at the forest. "Big Ma, what was Mr. Granger doing here?" Stacy asked, jumping from the wagon and going to her. Little Man Christopher John and I hopped down and followed him. "Nothing," Big Ma replied absently, her eyes still on the forest. "Just worrying me about this land again." "Oh," said Stacy, his tone indicating that he considered the visit of no importance. Mr. Granger had always wanted the land. He turned and helped Mr. Morrison. Little Man Christopher John went with him, but I remained by the gate with Big Ma. "Big Ma," I said, "what Mr. Granger need more land for?" "Don't need it," Mama said flatly. "Got more land now than he knows what to do with." "Well, what he want with ours then?" "Just like to have it, that's all." "Well, seems to me he's just being greedy. You ain't gonna sell it to him, are you?" Big Ma didn't answer me. Instead, she pushed open the gate and walked down the drive and across the road into the forest. I ran after her. We walked in silence down the narrow cow path, which wound through the old forest to the pond. As we neared the pond, the forest gaped open into a wide brown glade, man-made by the felling of many trees, some of them still on the ground. They'd been cut during the summer after Mr. Anderson came from Strawberry with an offer to buy the trees. The offer was backed with a threat, and Big Ma was afraid. So Mr. Anderson's lumbermen came, chopping and sawing, destroying the fine old trees. Papa was away at the railroad then, but Mama sent Stacy for him. He returned and stopped the cutting, but not before many of the trees had already fallen. I love that part because it goes back and tells the story in just a tiny summary. Song of the Trees. Big Ma surveyed the clearing without a word. Then, stepping around the rotting trees, she made her way to the pond and sat down on one of them. I sat close beside her, and we know how Cassie feels about the trees, right? And waited for her to speak. After a while, she shook her head and said, "I'm sure glad your grandpapa never had to see none of this. He dearly loved these here old trees. Him and me, we used to come down here early mornings or just before the sun was about to set and just sit and talk. He used to call this place his thinking spot, and he called that old pond there Caroline, after me." She smiled vaguely, but not at me. "You know, I wasn't hardly 18 when Paul Edward married me and brung me here. He was older than me by about 8 years, and he was smart. Oh, Lord! That was one smart man. He had himself a mind like a steel trap. Anything he seen done, he could do it. He done learned carpentry back up there near Mason, Georgia, where he was born. Born into slavery he was, 2 years 'fore freedom come. And him and his mama stayed on at that plantation after the fighting was finished. But then, when he got to be 14 and his mama died, he left that place and worked his way across up here to Vicksburg." "That's where he met you, ain't it, Big Ma?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Big Ma nodded, smiling. "Sure was. He was carpentering up there, and my papa took me into Vicksburg with him. We was tenant farming 'bout 30 miles from there to see about getting a store-bought rocker for my mama, and there was old Paul Edward working in the furniture store just as big. Had himself a good job, but that old job wasn't what he wanted. He wanted himself some land. Kept on and on talking about land, and then this place came up for sale. And he bought himself 200 acres from that Yankee, didn't he?" Big Ma chuckled. "That man went right on over to see Mr. Hollenbeck and said, 'Mr. Hollenbeck, I understand you got land to sell, and I'll be interested in buying me about 200 acres if your price is right.' Old Mr. Hollenbeck questioned him good about where he's going to get the money to pay him, but Paul Edward just said, "Don't seem to me that you're worried about how I'm going to get the money just as long as you get paid your price." Did nothing scare that man, she beamed proudly. And Mr. Hollenbeck went right on and let him have it. Of course, now he was just about as eager to sell the land as Paul Edward was to buy. He'd had it for going on 20 years. Bought it during Reconstruction from the Grangers because they didn't have no money to pay their taxes. Not only did they not have money, didn't have to pay taxes, didn't have no money at all. That war left them plumb broke. Their old Confederate money wasn't worth nothing, and both Northern and Southern soldiers had done ransacked their place. Them Grangers didn't have nothing but their land left, and they had to sell 2,000 acres of it to get money to pay them taxes and rebuild the rest of it. And that Yankee bought up the whole 2,000. Then he turned around and tried to sell it back to him, huh, Big Ma? Sure did, but not till '87 when your grandpa bought himself that 200 acres. As I hears it, that Yankee offered to sell all 2,000 acres back to Harlan Granger's daddy for less than the land was worth. But old Fillmore Granger was just about as tight with a penny as anybody ever lived, and he wouldn't sell it back. So Mr. Hollenbeck just let other folks know he was selling, and didn't take long before he sold all of it, because it was some mighty fine land. Besides, your grandpa, a bunch of other small farmers bought up 800 acres, and Mr. Jameson bought the rest. But that wasn't all Mr. Jameson, I supplied knowingly. That was his daddy. Charles Jameson was his name, Big Ma said. A fine old gentleman, too. He was a good neighbor, and he always treated us fair, just like his son. The Jamesons was what folks called Old South from up in Vicksburg, and as I understand it, before the war they had as much money as anybody. And even after the war, they managed better than some folks because they had made themselves some northern money. Anyway, old Mr. Jameson got it into his mind that he wanted to farm, and he moved his family from Vicksburg down here. Mr. Wade Jameson was about 8 years old then, but he didn't like to farm. I said, "Oh, he liked it all right, just never had much a hand at it, though. And after he went up north to law school and all, he just felt he ought to practice law. Is that how come he sold Grandpa them other 200 acres? Sure is. And it was mighty good of him to do it, too. My Paul Edward had been eyeing that 200 acres ever since 1910 when he done paid off the bank for the first 200. But old Mr. Jameson didn't want to sell. About that same time, Harlan Granger come head of the Granger plantation, him and Wade Jameson about the same year as children. And he wanted to buy back every inch of land that used to belong to the Grangers. That man's crazy about anything that was theirs before the war, and he wanted his land to be every bit like it was then. Already had more than 4,000 acres. He was just itching to have back the other 2,000 his granddaddy sold. Got back 800 of them, too, from the other farmers that bought from Mr. Hollenbeck. But Grandpa and Uncle and old Mr. Jameson wasn't interested in selling, period, was they, Big Ma? They didn't care how much money Mr. Granger offered them, I declared with an emphatic nod. That's the truth of it, all right, agreed Big Ma. But when Mr. Jameson died in 1918 and Wade came head of the family, he sold them 200 acres to Paul Edward and the rest of the land to Harlan Granger and moved his family into Strawberry. He could have just as easily sold the full 1,000 acres to the Grangers and gotten more money, but he didn't. Until this day, Harlan Granger still holds it against him because he didn't. The soft swish of fallen leaves made Big Ma look up from the pond at the trees again. Her lips curved into a tender smile as she looked about thoughtfully. She said, "I can still see Paul Edward's face the day Mr. Jameson sold him those 200 acres. He put his arms around me and looked out at this piece of land. He said exactly the same thing he said when he grabbed himself to first 200 acres. He said, 'Pretty Caroline, how you like to learn to work this fine piece of earth with me?' He did, said the exact same thing." She grew quiet then and rubbed the wrinkles down one hand as if to smooth them away. I gazed at the pond, glassy gray and calm, till she was ready to go on. I had learned that at times like these it was better to just sit and wait than to go on asking disrupting questions, which might vex her. Vex means make her angry. So long ago now, she said eventually in a voice that was almost a whisper. We worked real hard getting them crops sown and getting them reaped. We had us a time, but there was good times too. We was young and strong when we started out, and we liked to work. Neither one of us, I'm proud to say, was lazy, and we didn't raise us no lazy children either. Had ourselves 6 fine children. Lost our girls when they was babies, though. I suppose that's one of the reasons I love your sweet mama so much. But them boys grew strong, and all of 'em love this place as much as Paul Edward and me. They go away, they always come back. Couldn't leave it. She shook her head and sighed. Then Mitchell, he got killed in the war, and Kevin got drowned. Her voice faded completely. But when she spoke again, it had hardened, and there was a determined glint in her eyes. Now all the boys I got is my baby boys. Your papa and your Uncle Hammer. And this they place as much as it is mine. They bloods in this land. And here that Harlan Granger always talking about buying it. He pestered Paul Edward to death about buying it. Now he's pestering me. Huh, she grumbled again. He don't know nothing about me or this land he think I'm going to sell. She became silent again. A cold wind rose, biting through my jacket, and I shivered. Big Ma looked down at me for the first time. You cold? No, ma'am, I stuttered, not ready to leave the forest. Don't you be lying to me, girl, she snapped, putting up her hand. It's time we got back to the house. Anyways, your mama will be home soon. I took her hand, and together we left the Caroline. Despite our every effort to persuade Stacy otherwise, when Mama came home, he confessed that he'd been fighting TJ at the Wallace store and that Mr. Morrison had stopped it. He stood awkwardly before her, disclosing only those things which he could honorably mention. He said nothing to TJ's cheating or that Christopher John, little man, and I had been with him. And when Mama asked him a question he could not answer honestly, he simply looked at his feet and refused to speak. The rest of us sat fidgeting nervously throughout the interview, and when Mama looked our way, we swiftly found somewhere else to rest our eyes. Finally, seeing that she'd gotten all the information she was going to get from Stacy, Mama turned to us. I suppose you 3 went to that store too, huh? But before any of us could squeak an answer, she exclaimed, That does it! And I began to pace the floor, her arms folded, her face crossed. Although she scolded us severely, she did not whip us. We were sent to bed early, but we didn't consider that a punishment. We doubted that Mama did either. How we managed to escape a whipping, we couldn't fathom. Until Saturday, when Mama woke us up before dawn and piled us into the wagon, taking us southwest towards Snelling's Creek. She said, Where we're going, the man is very sick, and he doesn't look like other people. But I don't want you to be afraid or uncomfortable when you see him. Just be yourselves. And that made me wonder where she was bringing them. Who wouldn't look like other people? We rode for almost 2 hours before turning onto a backwoods trail. We were jarred and bounced over the rough road until we entered a clearing where a small, weather-grayed house stood and fields stretched barren beyond it. As Mama pulled up on the reins and ordered us down, the front door cracked wearily open, but no one appeared. Then Mama said, Good morning, Mrs. Barry. It's Mary Logan, David's wife. You guys remember who the Barrys are. The Barrys are the ones who were set on fire by the white men. The door swung wide then, and an elderly woman, frail and toothless, stepped out. Her left arm hung crazily at her side as if it had been broken long ago but had not mended properly, and she walked with a limp. Yet she smiled widely, throwing her good arm around Mama and hugging her. Land sakes, child, ain't you something? She exclaimed. Come and see about these old bones. I just says to Sam, I said, who you reckon come see old folks like us? These your babies, ain't they? Ain't they? they? Lord Almighty, ain't they fine, they is? She hugged each of us and ushered us into the house. The interior was dark, lit only by the narrow slat of gray daylight allowed in by the open door. Stacy and I carried cans of milk and butter. Christopher John and Little Man each had a jar of beef and a jar of crowder peas, which Mama and Big Ma had canned. Mrs. Barry took the food, her thanks intermingled with questions about Big Ma, Papa, and others. When she had put the food away, she pulled stools from the darkness and motioned us to sit down. Then she went to the blackest corner and said, Daddy, who you s'pose come see about us? There was no recognizable answer, only an inhuman, guttural wheezing. But Mrs. Barry seemed to accept it and went on. Miss Logan and her babies, ain't that something? She took a sheet from a nearby table. Gots to cover him, she explained. He can't hardly stand to have nothing touch him. When she was visible again, she picked up a candle stump and felt around a table for matches. He can't speak no more. The fire burned him too bad, but he understands all right. I just want you to imagine, I'm sure everybody has probably been burnt at some point, whether it's by, a stove or a candle or something, with a fire pit or a stick at, when you're roasting marshmallows and the stick is really hot. But, and I'm sure many of you have seen skin, blister from just a tiny burn like that, from just touching something hot for a second. So I want you to try to imagine something lit on fire. And I want you to imagine what that would feel like if you know what just a tiny little burn feels like. If you could try and imagine what an entire body, face, head, and all would feel like. He can't speak no more. The fire burned him too bad, but he understands all right. Finding the matches, she lit the candle and turned once more to the corner. A still form lay there staring at us with glittering eyes. The face had no nose and the head no hair. The skin was scarred, burned, and the lips were wizened black like charcoal. As the wheezing sound echoed from the opening that was a mouth, Mama said, Say good morning to Mrs. Barry's husband, children. The boys and I stammered a greeting, then sat silently, trying not to stare at Mr. Barry during the hour that we remained in the small house. But Mama talked softly to Mr. and Mrs. Barry, telling them news of the community as if Mr. Barry were as normal as anyone else. After we were on the main road home again, having ridden in thoughtful silence over the wooded trail, Mama said quietly, The Wallaces did that, children. They poured kerosene over Mr. Barry and his nephews and lit them afire. One of the nephews died. The other one is just like Mr. Barry. She allowed this information to penetrate the silence, then went on. Everyone knows they did it. And the Wallaces even laugh about it, but nothing was ever done. They are bad people, the Wallaces. That's why I don't want you to ever go to their store again for any reason. Do you understand? We nodded, unable to speak, as we thought of the disfigured man lying in the darkness. On the way home, we stopped at the homes of some of Mama's students, where families poured out of tenant shacks to greet us. At each farm, Mama spoke of the bad influence of the Wallaces, of the smoking and drinking permitted at their store, and asked that the family's children not be allowed to go there. The people nodded and said she was right. She also spoke of finding another store to patronize. Patronize means to shop at. Patronizing is spending money at a place, whether it's a restaurant, a store, post office. One where the proprietors were more concerned about the welfare of the community. But she didn't speak directly of what the Wallaces had done to the Barrys, for as she explained later, that was something that wavered between the known and the unknown, and to mention it outright to anyone outside of those closest to was not wise. There were too many ears that listened for others besides themselves, and too many tongues that wagged to those they shouldn't. And that makes me think about the teacher, the ones who are trying to, stay always on good terms with whites, even if it means making your own people feel terrible. The people only nodded, and Mama left. When we reached the Turner farm, Moe's widowed father rubbed his stubbled chin and squinted across the room at Mama.
Miss Logan, you know I feels the same way you about them low-down Wallaces, but it ain't easy to just stop shopping there. They overcharges me and I has to pay 'em high interest, but I gets credit there 'cause Mr. Montier signs for me. Now you know most folks around here shop sharecropping on Montier, Granger, or Harrison land, and most of 'em just about gots to shop at the Wallace store or at the Mercantile and Strawberry, which is just about as bad. Can't go no place else.
Mama nodded solemnly, showing she understood. Then she said, for the past year now, our family's been shopping in Vicksburg. There are a number of stores down there, and we've found several that treat us well.
Vicksburg? Mr. Turner echoed, shaking his head. Lord, Miss Logan, you ain't expecting me to go all the way to Vicksburg. That's an overnight journey in a wagon down there and back.
Mama thought on that a moment. What if someone would be willing to make the trip for you? Go all the way to Vicksburg and bring back what you need.
Won't do no good, retorted Mr. Turner. I got no cash money. Mr. Montier signs for me at the Wallace store so I can get my tools, my mule, my seed, my fertilizer, my food, and what few clothes I need to keep my children from running plump naked. When cotton picking time comes, he sells my cotton, takes half of it, pays my debt at the store, my interest for their credit, and then charges me 10 to 15% more for at risk for signing for me in the first place. This year, I earned me nearly $200 after Mr. Montier took his half of the crop money, but I ain't seen a penny of it. In fact, if I manages to come out even without owing that man nothing, I figures I've had a good year. Now, why? Who, way down in Vicksburg, gonna give a man like me credit?
Mama was very quiet and did not answer.
I'm sure sorry, Miss Logan. I'm gonna keep my youngins from up at that store, but I got to live. Y'all got it better than most folks around here because y'all got your own place. You don't have to cowtail to a lot of this stuff, but you gotta understand. It ain't easy for sharecropping folks to do what you asking.
Mr. Turner, Mama said in a whisper, if someone backed your signature, would you shop in Vicksburg then?
Mr. Turner looked at Mama strangely. Now, who would sign for me?
If someone would you do it? Mr. Turner gazed into the fire, burning to a low ash, then got up and put another log on it, taking his time as he watched the fire shoot upward and suck in the log. Without turning around, he said, when I was a wee little boy, I got burnt real bad. It healed over. I ain't never forgot the pain of it. It's an awful way to die. Then turning, he faced Mama. Ms. Logan, you find someone to sign my credit, and I'll consider it deeply. After we left the Turners, Stacy asked, Mama, who you gonna get to sign? But Mama, her brow furrowed, did not reply. I started to repeat the question, but Stacy shook his head, and I settled back, wondering. Then I fell asleep. And one of your vocabulary words is boycott, and that is what Mama is trying to establish here, a boycott, which is a very dangerous thing for a Black person to do in Mississippi in the 1930s. I'm going to stop there.